The saloon stank of sweat, tobacco, and old regret. Oil lamps flickered low, casting shadows that crawled up the warped timber walls like ghosts hunting peace. The floor was a graveyard of spilled whiskey and broken promises. And at the far corner table, under a haze of cigar smoke, a man named Luke McCrae shuffled his last set of cards with hands worn by war and ranch work. He hadn't come to town for poker. He hadn't come for company either. Luke didn't do much of anything for pleasure anymore. The world had taken his wife 3 winters ago. Pneumonia, they said. But he blamed the Colden god for that. Since then, the ranch had become more tomb than home. Last hand, the old man across from him slurred, sliding forward a small, dented coin purse. Then came the words that stilled every voice in the saloon. One last hand for the girl. Laughter died in throats, chairs creaked as heads turned. A few chuckled, thinking it a sick joke. But the man gestured to the back, where a shadow detached from the wall. She came forward slowly. A young woman, slim, shackled at the wrists with iron cuffs, a burlap sack pulled tight over her head. She made no sound. Her dress was torn and muddy. Her boots, if they were boots, had no solace left. Luke blinked once, his fingers pausing on the deck. "Damn it, someone muttered, half rising from their seat. "I mean it," Ira barked, eyes shining too bright. "She's mine. To wager. Railroad foreman gave her to me in St. Louis for a debt same as any mare, and I'm calling it fair." Luke didn't speak. He didn't have to. The room leaned in, heavy with silence and the weight of 100 wrong choices. The cards were dealt. 3 players, sweat trickled down brows. A bottle shattered near the bar. Someone muttered prayers. Luke's hand was nothing special, but the eyes behind his stubble-laced face stayed unreadable. He pushed forward the deed to a breeding bull he didn't even like, the last of his cash, and the black and silver ring he still wore around his neck. When Ayare laid his hand down to pair, jacks and eights, he laughed like a man about to stand on a scaffold. Luke laid his down slower. A straight flush. Ira's grin cracked and vanished like dried paint. "She's yours," he said, voice gone small. "Take the girl and go." The girl didn't move as the sack was removed. Her face emerged pale and filthy beneath the flickering lamplight. Eyes dull, lips split. She blinked at the world as if unsure it was real. Luke stood. The room didn't cheer, didn't laugh. Some turned away in shame. Others watched, silent and frozen. "You gonna keep her?" someone asked. Luke looked at the girl not as a prize, but as a human being the world had forgotten. "No man should be owned," he said. "No woman either." He reached for her gently, expecting resistance. There was none. She followed, shackles clinking with each step. Outside, the wind had picked up. Dust coiled in little devils down the empty street. Luke helped her onto the back of his horse, tying his coat around her shoulders. She still hadn't spoken. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe the world had shouted over her voice for too long. He mounted in front of her. She gripped the saddle horn as if it were a lifeline. They rode out of town without a word. The saloon doors creaked behind them, and the road swallowed their tracks in dust. Luke didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. And truth be told, he wasn't sure why he'd taken her. But as the stars bled across the prairie sky, something in the silence between them stirred. Not desire, not duty, something like remembering what it meant to feel human again. The wind howled low across the plains as Luke guided the horse toward his ranch, the girl still silent behind him. The land unfurled like a forgotten wound-brittle grass, broken fences and barns that leaned like old men praying for mercy. The gate hung crooked, rusted chain dragging against the post. No one came to greet them. Only the crows circled. He dismounted and offered her his hand. She stared at it for a long second before slipping off without help. Her boots sank into the wet earth. Her eyes stayed on the ground, and Luke didn't try to stop her. Inside, the house hadn't changed since Sarah died. Dust gathered on the mantel where her picture still stood, untouched. The curtains remained open in the parlor, letting in gray light that turned the room into a museum of someone else's life. Luke hadn't moved a thing. Couldn't. He made her a bed by the stove and left food on the table, venison stew and a hunk of cornbread. She didn't touch it. Not that day. Not the next. Just sat curled in silence, knees drawn to her chest, hands wrapped around something hanging from her neck, a locket, old and tarnished, worn smooth from years of clutching. Luke watched from the doorway. She wasn't broken. She was buried inside herself, deep, like something alive under ice. On the third morning, he saddled his horse and stared down the path toward town. Sheriff wouldn't ask many questions, might even thank him for handing her over. But something stopped him, some tiny, stubborn feeling, the way she held that locket, the silence that filled the room, not with fear, but with something too familiar, sorrow. He unsaddled the horse and set about mending the fence instead. That night, the storm came. Spring had arrived too soon and too cold. Snow fell in sheets, hissing against the windows. Luke found her outside, half frozen and clutching an armful of firewood, her lips blue, her knees buckling. "Damn fool girl," he muttered, lifting her into his arms. She didn't resist. Her head lolled against his shoulder, too weak to protest. He laid her by the fire, wrapped her in wool blankets and boiled water. She burned with fever all night, muttering things in half-sleep, names, places, maybe prayers. Luke wiped her brow and fed her spoonfuls of broth. He never spoke. But he didn't leave her side. By dawn, the worst had passed. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time she looked at him, not past him, not through him. After that, things shifted. She still said nothing, but she moved, swept the floor, cleaned dishes. She stitched a ripped curtain without being asked, repaired a broken shutter that Luke had ignored for years. She moved quiet as a ghost, but she was present now. One evening, as the sun sank orange and low, Luke heard humming from the porch, a tune, fragile and slow. He froze, the sound like an arrow in his gut. Sarah used to sing that song in the kitchen, in the bath. At night, when the wind rattled the shutters, he stepped onto the porch. The girl stood there, eyes closed, hands folded, face turned toward the setting sun. She stopped when she saw him. He didn't say anything, just turned and walked back inside, jaw clenched against the ache rising in his chest. Days passed. The snow melted. The earth softened. Luke returned from the north pasture one afternoon and found her kneeling by the hill behind the barn. Sarah's grave, wildflowers in her hand. She laid them gently on the stone, no ceremony, no words. Just stillness and respect. He watched from afar, throat tight. She had found it on her own. Somehow, she'd known. That night he poured 2 mugs of coffee instead of 1 and left hers on the table. She drank it. Still no name. Still no voice, but something had changed between them. The next morning, at first light, Luke stood on the porch, arms crossed. The sky blushed pale pink above the plains. The girl stood near the fence line, hair loose and stirring in the breeze, locket shining faint in the dawn. She looked out over the land like it might remember her name before she did. Luke studied her. From the steps, boots cold, heart heavier than he'd admit. He didn't know what she was, a burden, a penance, or maybe a miracle in rough cloth. But one thing was certain, he didn't feel alone anymore. The night came in hard and fast, a black wind curling low through the hills like something feral on the hunt. Luke felt it before he saw anything, an unease in his bones, the kind that never really left a man after the war. The girl had fallen asleep by the fire, that same locket curled in her fist. She hadn't spoken a word since arriving, but she'd begun humming again earlier, that same mournful melody. Now even that was gone. Luke stepped outside. The stars were out, but the moon was veiled behind clouds. The wind shifted. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats, more than one. He moved fast into the barn, where his old rifle waited just behind the door. Before he could reach it, a shot cracked through the dark like a whip. The horse screamed. Luke flung the door open. His gelding lay in the dirt, writhing. The bullet had struck the neck. Blood soaked into the dust. Luke didn't hesitate. 1. Clean shot, and the horse went still. Then came the voices. "Luke McCrae," a gruff man called out from the tree line. "You've got something don't belong to you." Luke's jaw clenched. The girl was already at the door, half-dressed, eyes wide. She ran from a workhouse down in Missouri, the man continued. Boss paid good money for her. I never had the right to wager her, but we do, Luke didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the girl inside and shoved the rifle into her hands. You ever used one? She didn't move, just stared at him. If they get in, he said low. You shoot, don't think. Don't hesitate. You shoot. Outside, the bandits came into view, 3 of them. 1 on foot, 2 still mounted. They were armed, confident, laughing. Then a torch sailed through the air. The barn caught fire before Luke even raised his weapon. Flames licked the hayloft in. Seconds, the night roared orange and red, gunfire erupted. Luke dropped one man with a clean shot to the shoulder. The others scattered, firing wildly. Something struck Luke in the side blunt, hard. He stumbled behind the trough, bleeding, dizzy. One of them was close now, maybe 10 feet away, raising his pistol for a final shot, a shriek of wind. Then an arrow dot struck the bandit clean through the chest. He dropped without a sound. From the edge of the trees, a figure stepped forward, tall, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat. Dark hair braided with feathers, a bow in one hand, a tomahawk in the other. The last bandit fled into the dark. Luke blinked through pain and smoke. The stranger met his eyes, nodded once, and melted back into the trees without a word. Inside the house, the girl still crouched behind the table, rifle shaking in her hands, trigger untouched. She hadn't fired. Luke collapsed near the doorway, breath ragged. She crawled to him, tried to stop the bleeding, hands trembling. Should have shot him, he rasped. She shook her head violently. Tears welled but didn't fall. They stayed up the rest of the night, watching the barn burn down to its bones. The flames painted her face in flickers of sorrow and something else, guilt, maybe Dot at sunrise. Luke sat on the porch steps, shirt bloodied, side bandaged. She stood beside him, silent, until finally her voice came. Mara. He turned his head slowly. She wasn't looking at him. My name, it's Mara. She sat down beside him, hands clenched. My mother was a laundress for the Missouri Pacific. She died. I was 13. They sold me to a foreman who wanted someone to keep house. Ira bought me in a card game. Saw it I wasn't worth the whiskey he lost for me. Luke didn't speak for a long time. The prairie was still. Only the wind moved. I couldn't pull the trigger, she whispered. I wanted to. I tried. I just couldn't. You're not a killer, he said. She looked at him then, tears tracing dirt down her cheeks. I'm not anything. You're alive, Luke said. That's something. Later that day they buried the horse behind the barn, near the fence line where Sarah had once planted lilacs. Luke dug the grave himself, even with the wound. Mara knelt beside him, silent, hands raw from helping. She placed a handful of wildflowers on the fresh dirt. Up on the ridge, the stranger stood watching, still and tall as a monument. He met Mara's gaze for a moment, then turned and vanished into the hills, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his silent arrival. Luke watched the ridge for a long while. After something had changed in the girl, now in Mara. She'd been spoken for too many times. Now she'd spoken for herself, and in the fire and blood of that night, something buried in both of them had stirred awake. Asterisk, asterisk, the fire had left black scars on the land-charred fence posts, ashes in the grass, but it hadn't taken everything. Spring rolled in with reluctant warmth. The earth softened and Mara walked barefoot through the soil, sleeves rolled, shoulders pink with sun. Together, she and Luke rebuilt what had burned. The new barn walls stood straighter, stronger. She patched the roof with care, hammer in hand, while he fixed the gate and rewired the water pump. For the first time in years, the well didn't groan when it gave up water. It sang. One morning, a calf was born. Mara found it nestled against its mother, still slick and trembling. She knelt beside it, hands steady, voice calm. Luke arrived, just in time to see her smile. A full, unguarded smile that cracked through the shell she had carried like armor. Later that week, he brought out his wife's old saddle. It hadn't been used in years. Mara stared at it like it was a relic from another world. You ever ride? he asked. She shook her head. Then it's about time. They spent hours in the pasture, Luke guiding her hands, catching her when she slipped. She laughed when the horse bucked slightly, clutching his arm. Her laughter felt like sunlight, rare and utterly real. That evening, Luke dusted off the phonograph, wound it up, and dropped the needle. Fiddle music scratched its way through the air, filling the cabin with warmth. Mara stood in the kitchen doorway, hair braided down her back, eyes shining with something soft and wary. He extended his hand. "I've got 2 left feet," he warned. "So, do I?" she whispered. They danced, slow and awkward, boots scuffing the floor. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The music said enough, but peace never stays long on the prairie. It came on a night swollen with storm. Thunder grumbled in the hills. Mara went to fetch kindling from the woodshed and didn't come back. Luke stepped outside and saw the man, the last bandit, the leader. Ira's brother, taller, meaner, dripping with rain, eyes full of vengeance. He had Mara by the arm, a pistol to her temple. "You killed my kin," he spat. "I'm talking her and burning what's left of you." Luke reached for his gun, but someone was behind him already. A blow to the back of his head dropped him to his knees. They tied his hands, shoved him into the mud. Mara struggled, but the man held fast. Then, from the ridge, came the whisper of fate. An arrow sliced the air. It struck the bandit's horse. Chaos erupted. Mara twisted free. Luke surged up, wrists raw, teeth gritted. The second attacker turned. Too slow. Luke headbutted him, wrestled for the pistol, blood in his mouth, rain stinging his eyes. The leader raised his gun. Mara fired first. Her hands didn't shake this time. The man dropped in the mud, silent, final. Thunder cracked. The wind wept. And Mara stood above him, smoking pistol in hand, the rain soaking through her dress. Luke knelt beside her. She didn't cry. "Not yet. I couldn't save my mother," she whispered. "But I saved you." The next day, they buried the man far from the house. No marker, no words. Luke didn't ask her to stay. He looked at her across the fence they'd begun to rebuild. Hands blistered, heart raw. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but if you stay, it'd be as yourself, free." Mara looked at the horizon, at the hills, at the life she'd clawed her way back toward. "You never owned me," she said softly, "but you never let me be alone." They planted new posts together that afternoon, dug fresh earth, sank fence lines, then planted wildflower seeds at the edge of the pasture just in case the bees returned. The silent stranger returned once more. He stood on the ridge at sundown, watching them work. No words, just a nod, a farewell not spoken but understood. Then he turned and walked into the trees, vanishing like the last shadow of war. That evening, Mara went to the grave behind the barn. Luke watched from the porch as she knelt, opened her locket, and left it on the headstone. A token laid to rest. Luke stepped onto the porch, the sky bleeding orange behind him. His voice low, heavy with memory. "Some things you win by chance, some by pain, but the rarest things you earn with your soul." Thanks for riding with us through this frontier tale. If you felt the fire of Mara and Luke's journey, drop a comment below. Tell us your favorite moment, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories from the edge of the wild. Until next time, ride hard, love true, and never bet on what your heart can't carry.